The opioid epidemic in the United States has reached alarming new heights with the rise of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that is 50 times more potent than heroin. Children under the age of 14 are particularly at risk, with synthetic opioid fatalities led by fentanyl poisonings among this age group increasing faster than any other U.S. age group. Fentanyl-related deaths among infants younger than 1 year and children ages 5 to 14 saw a near fourfold increase between 2019 and 2021, and deaths among toddlers between the ages of 1 and 4 more than tripled. This devastating trend is in part due to the fact that the drug is often ingested without the person's knowledge, as it can be mixed with other drugs and made to look like candy. The CDC reports that more than 100,000 people died of a drug overdose in 2021, and more than 65,000 of those deaths were linked to fentanyl. The opioid crisis in America has reached a boiling point, with the DEA intercepting an alarming amount of fentanyl in 2022. 10,000 pounds of the deadly drug were seized along with over 50 million pills, enough to kill every person in the United States. To make matters worse, this amount was more than double what was seized in the previous year, signifying that the problem is only getting worse. So now the question is, how did we get here? Well, the opioid epidemic we see today can be traced back to the 1990s, when there was a push towards using opioid medications for chronic pain management. Pharmaceutical companies heavily promoted these medications to medical professionals, claiming they were safe for long-term use and non-addictive. Prior to this, opioids were only prescribed for acute pain related to cancer or terminal illnesses. This shift in mindset led to a consistent increase in these prescriptions. From 1990 to 1999, the number of prescriptions grew from 76 million to 116 million. As the volume of prescriptions increased, so did the potency of the drugs. By 2002, 1 in 6 drug users were prescribed drugs more powerful than morphine. As a result, admissions for substance use disorder treatments and opioid-related deaths began to rise. This prompted government action, with states passing laws to prevent overprescription of these drugs. An example of this is the pill mill bill, which aimed to limit these prescriptions by requiring doctors to perform a full history and provide only a short course. While the intentions were noble, the bill was not well thought out, as it forced those with established dependencies to transition towards more concentrated and cheaper alternatives such as heroin. Between 2005 and 2012, the number of people who used heroin almost doubled from 380,000 to 670,000. And this is where fentanyl enters the picture. The fentanyl we see today can be traced back to the efforts of Janssen Pharmaceuticals to create a more potent painkiller. Back in the 1950s, Dr. Paul Janssen and his team at Janssen Pharmaceuticals were on a mission to create a new analgesic with a more rapid onset and fewer side effects than the options available at the time. In 1953, they began experimenting with meperidine, a popular analgesic, and manipulated various parts of the molecule while preserving its ability to bind to the same pain receptors in the brain. Their efforts were successful and led to numerous new compounds that were over tens of times more potent than morphine. In 1960, they struck gold and created fentanyl. Test results were incredible. Results showed that it was between 100 to 200 times stronger than morphine. However, they faced resistance from Dr. Drips, a professor of anesthesiology at the University of Pennsylvania, who knew the drug was simply too potent and vulnerable to abuse. The FDA was also hesitant to approve the drug, but Janssen Pharmaceuticals found a solution by mixing fentanyl with droperidol. The combination increased the sedative effect, while also reducing the unpleasant subjective effects and restlessness associated with droperidol given alone. This was enough to convince the rest of the medical community, and FDA finally approved fentanyl to be used with droperidol in 1968. But this was only temporary. 4 years later, fentanyl was approved for use alone, and that's when fentanyl started to hit the market. But this was the 1970s, and we all know doctors weren't prescribing opioids to their patients. And even during the first wave of opioid epidemic in 1990s, fentanyl didn't take off. It was during the 2010s, at the height of heroin overuse, when fentanyl entered the picture. Fentanyl, being a synthetic drug produced in a lab environment, has the advantage of not requiring large amounts of land to grow. This makes it easier to hide and produce. Its cheaper cost and higher potency compared to heroin makes it an attractive option for drug dealers. Therefore, dealers began cutting heroin and other drugs with fentanyl to cut costs while maintaining the potency of their product. They also started using the drug to produce fake pills that resembled standard prescription medications or less dangerous party drugs. And this is what caused things to go out of control because fentanyl is a highly potent opioid that can cause severe issues when misused. One way to understand just how potent fentanyl can be is that it often negates the effects of naloxone, an antidote used to reverse overdoses. First responders usually administer 1 dose of naloxone to revive someone who has overdosed on common painkillers or heroin. However, multiple doses may be necessary to counteract a fentanyl overdose, and in some cases a continuous IV of naloxone may be required. Additionally, it is often unclear how the person overdosed because fentanyl is sometimes taken unknowingly. And overdosing on opioids is particularly dangerous as they affect the part of the brain that regulates breathing. This means an overdose can stop a person from breathing and ultimately result in death. This is why opioids can be lethal, with fentanyl particularly elevating the chances of overdose. And things aren't getting any better as stopping the spread of fentanyl remains a challenge. You see, the production of fentanyl is primarily taking place in China. In some instances, Chinese suppliers manufacture the main components of the drug and then ship them to Mexico, where they are assembled by drug cartels and smuggled into the United States through traditional means. Additionally, the emergence of local labs within the United States has further exacerbated the problem, as customers are now able to order the drug directly to their door via the dark web. This works by Chinese companies manufacturing the drug and then sending it to a person posing as a legitimate chemical company in the United States. These lab-to-lab deliveries are not suspicious and most of the products pass through easily. From there, the US-based lab can send out packages of the odorless fentanyl straight to the customer's door. Even more alarming is that customers can now use social media platforms like Snapchat to order the deadly pills, which will arrive at their doorstep in an instant. This highlights the need for more stringent measures to be put in place to combat this growing problem. Currently, there have been instances where packages containing fentanyl have been intercepted and traced back to Chinese laboratories. However, the US authorities are unable to take any action in China due to the lack of support from the Chinese government. The strained relationship between the US and China has resulted in the latter cutting off all communication channels with the former, making it highly unlikely for the two countries to work together to address the fentanyl crisis. Despite this, China is making efforts to curb the production of fentanyl within its borders by cracking down on manufacturing labs. This has led to some success, but drug manufacturers have now shifted their operations to India. The move to India is a result of difficulties in obtaining precursor chemicals in China and increased pressure from the Chinese authorities. The shift of fentanyl production to India presents an even bigger problem. India has a strong chemical and pharmaceutical industry, a huge population that is hard to monitor, high levels of poverty, and corruption among local officials. Some experts believe that the combination of these factors makes India an even more challenging environment for addressing the fentanyl crisis. While it may seem daunting, there is hope for the nation to overcome this epidemic. With the availability of naloxone, every individual can play a role in preventing tragic overdoses. This medication can now be obtained without a prescription from many pharmacies, providing easier access for those in need. In addition, increased education and outreach efforts are being made to educate the public on the dangers of fentanyl use and how to prevent overdoses. While there is still much work to be done, the increased availability of naloxone and efforts to raise awareness give us hope that we can turn the tide on this devastating epidemic. With continued dedication and effort, the United States can overcome the opioid crisis and ensure a brighter, healthier future for all.